Hi there and welcome back to another episode at Station Road, and today we have our first review of a locomotive, and this being the Hornby Thomson Class 01. So just a brief sort of rundown of what I'm hoping to cover in my reviews. It is looking at the products from the point of view of the model railway buyer, thus being me, and hopefully that sort of applies in a similar level to most of you guys. So rather than sort of delving into the really nitty gritty stuff about the mechanisms and things like that, it's more a case of, well, how does a product stand up against similar products on the market, how they fare in terms of price, detail, and how well do they run. So another aspect I'm not really going to cover in the reviews is any type of historical information about the prototypes themselves. That would really mean quite a considerable amount of research, and it's pretty easy to be able to Google up, for example, the history of the Thompson Class locomotive and where it originated and what it was used for and all those types of things. So in terms of what I do plan to cover in the reviews is firstly the price. I think that's quite a key component, and then another one of course is operational ability, and then of course down to things like tooling and detail. So I think the best way for me to actually approach these types of things is possibly to compare different aspects with other products and manufacturers. So another thing that I'm probably also going to avoid is doing unboxings. That is really not what the review is about. I don't need to review the box. It is the product that wants to be reviewed. So I think without further ado, let's just get into this review and see what you make of it. So where did I buy this particular locomotive? Now, I spotted this on the Hatton's website only a couple of months back, and they were selling this for a minimal sum of £79. Now, the RRP for this locomotive from Hornby is £133.49. And in preparation for this review, I went back to the Hatton's website, and they no longer seem to have it in stock. Now, I did have a little bit of a hunt around, and the best price I can find now is from the Model Centre, and they are selling these for £93.44. So that price is reasonably close, and knowing what I purchased and the quality, detail and running characteristics, I would probably quite happily pay £93 for it as well. Would I pay £133 for it? Probably not. Now, a little bit of history about the Hornby Thomson 01 class. It was originally first released in 2011, or at least that's where the tooling appears to be dated from. And I did a hunt around amongst a large collection of magazines I have, and found a review for this in 2012. Now, from doing some close inspection and comparison between the model I've purchased and this review that was in 2012, it is the same tooling. I can see no differences. The only thing that may have changed, although I'm not entirely sure, is in the magazine review from 2012. It claims the motor was a 3-pole motor. Now, I went online and found other references to that particular release date, and there is claims that it was actually a 5-pole motor. So I'm not quite sure which one is actually correct, but all I can actually say now is the model I have is a 5-pole motor. So based on the era of the tooling, which is essentially a decade old, I would expect the tooling to be maybe not quite up to today's standards. But in saying that, when I sort of take a closer look at the model, it stacks up reasonably well against today's models. And I think at the time in 2011, 2012, this locomotive would have actually been of a reasonably high standard of tooling. So according to the 2012 magazine review, the RRP was 125 pounds. So interestingly, in the last decade, the locomotive with the same tooling and possibly the same motor, in other words, no changes whatsoever, has gone up 10 pounds. So possibly based on 10 years of inflation, maybe that sounds about right. So taking a closer look at what is actually on offer in terms of detail, we'll start with the cab. And the cab detail, of course, being 10 years old, I think is pretty good tooling from this period. And when you compare it to a locomotive that was tooled in 2004, this being a Bachmann K3, you can clearly see that it does actually stack up very well in terms of its detail and features, separately fitted parts and separately painted components as well. Now, it wasn't until I had my macro zoom lens that you really start to see how well detail and painting has been applied within the cab. And of course there are some splodges of red paint that I can see that probably don't belong where they should be. You've also got a little bit of plastic flashing that hasn't been refined properly, and I would say that the glazing looks a little bit clumsy on the inside of the cab. But in saying that, this has been photographed at an incredibly high macro zoom, so it will pick out anything that's possibly a little bit skew with. So looking at the printed details on the locomotive, they do stack up reasonably well. I'm not entirely sure whether these printing details might just simply be revived from the original 2011 tooling, but when compared with some other very recent releases of locomotives, it does seem to stack up reasonably well. So when it came to photographing these very small printed decals, I made sure that they were all photographed in exactly the same way, the same distance from the camera, the same focal length, the same lighting and so forth, so we could get as a true comparison as possible. So the first example here, and on the left we have our Thompson locomotive, and on the right we have the Bachmann Class 47. Now this is the new Class 47, and incidentally that will come up in a review at some point, and it is completely new tooling and printing, so the comparison is very minimal between these two. And as I mentioned, they're photographed at exactly the same distance, so the sizes or proportions that you see on the screen now are actually in direct comparison with each other. Now the next example is another recent purchase, and once again it will come up in review as well, and this is the EFE Rail Class 35 Hymic. Now we know that this is a re-release of a Helgen locomotive that actually dates back to 2004. So once again you can see the comparison is quite minimal, albeit I will say that the Class 35 British Railways logo does look a little bit chunky and seems to lack a little bit of finesse. And then lastly we look at this comparison with the Bachmann K3. Now this locomotive dates back to 2004, and you can clearly see in the British Railways logo on the K3 it certainly looks a little bit more chunky and once again lacks a little bit of finer detail. However, it seems that the manufacturer's plate on the K3 seems reasonably well detailed and appears to be a reasonably close comparison to the Thompson. So other printed details on the Thompson of course include the printing on the smoke box door and also the running number on the cab, and they do look relatively sharp and clear. So some of the other aspects too that are worth noting on this locomotive is I find the coal load is actually really good. It's not the horrible big chunky coal loads that you often saw in steam locomotives, where the coal was really out of scale or it just simply looked too glossy and shiny or sparkly. Another thing to note is the cab vent in the roof. Now, this has been modelled open, you can't close it, but I don't actually mind it being open. It just sort of adds a little bit more interest and detail, and of course possibly during the summer months it would have been open quite a lot. Another important aspect that's worth noting is there's no seam line on the top of the boiler. This was often sometimes one of the Achilles heels of steam locomotives, is the plastic seam that you would see on top of the boiler. In this particular model there is no sign of such a ugly seam. So some of the other details that you would come to expect now from today's model locomotives include quite a lot of separately fitted parts. So we have individually fitted handrails, we have separately fitted lamp irons, there's also a reasonable amount of separately fitted detail on the running plate. There seems to be a separately fitted handbrake rod. The valve gear is exceptionally fine and detailed. We have separately fitted cylinder drain cocks, and these were pre-fitted. Sometimes you would find these in a detail bag to add yourself. We also have on the front buffer beam pre-fitted chain link couplings, and these look amazing. They look really well detailed, but they would have to be removed if you did want to add a coupling to the front of the locomotive. And then of course we also have the sprung buffers and what appears to be turned metal safety valves on the boiler, and in the cab area we do have separately fitted handbrake and handrails and cab doors. There's also flush glazing for the cab, and the model came with a detail pack which included brake rigging to be separately fitted. In terms of the usual detail, it's pretty good. Probably the only thing that could be a little bit of concern is the sandpipes are actually plastic. They're not a wire sandpipe, and they may have the tendency to break. And interestingly, on my model it appears that the sandpipe on the left hand side below the cab hasn't actually been fitted correctly, so it doesn't actually line up with the wheel rim. And I guess probably one other thing that I've just sort of spotted, although it doesn't really bother me too much, and that is the running plate is plastic, so it is not a die-cast running plate, and there is a little bit of a bow in the plastic because it is quite thin plastic. But when it's running around the layout, it's barely noticeable, these sort of minor discrepancies. It's interesting to note that on the right hand side of the locomotive the running plate is actually quite straight. So in terms of the mechanical connection between the tender and the locomotive on this Thompson locomotive, it's definitely an improvement on, for example, the connection we have between the tender and the locomotive for the Bachmann K3. Now, I always found their connections very frustrating and difficult to attach, and then they easily came out as well. But here on the Hornby Thomson we do have the drawbar screwed both ends, so there's no chance of it coming apart. And this is important for the electrical connection, which is connected via where plug and socket on the tender. Now, I will say I do find these connections a little bit tricky. You have to be very, very careful about how you unplug the tender from the locomotive. I have inadvertently damaged a previous locomotive that had this particular type of connection and had to do a wee repair job on it. And at the other end of the locomotive, of course, we have the pony truck. Now, the pony truck on this particular Thompson locomotive is unusual in the sense that it completely relies on the weight of the actual housing for the wheel set to stay down on the tracks. And although when I was running it, it didn't cause any problems, but you could actually see the pony jumping about when it went over points. Fortunately, not to the point where it derailed itself. Now, in comparison, I looked at the K3, and it actually has a spring mechanism in it that helps to keep the truck actually on the tracks, and I think that is a much more reliable method. Of course, the key to the spring mechanism is that the tension is not so great that it actually lifts the driving wheels up at the front. So in terms of its running, I actually found the running of this locomotive to be absolutely fantastic, and particularly for a steam locomotive, because usually they're not quite as smooth as a diesel locomotive with articulated bogies. But we can put down these exceptional running characteristics to a number of features. One is the 5-pole motor. That does make a big difference. It does have a flywheel inside the locomotive. And lastly, there is all-wheel pickup. So the driving wheels have pickups, and also the tender has pickups. So its crawl was absolutely incredible. It actually crawled at speed step 1 and its general running around the layout was absolutely fantastic. It negotiated all the points, all the quite complex track work that I do actually have in place on the layout. So in terms of that side of it, I just think that the mechanism, particularly because it's got that 5-pole motor in it, it does make it absolutely wonderful to run around the layout. Now I've installed a DCC Concepts decoder in the 8-pin socket, which is in the tender of the locomotive, and that is straight out of the box. I haven't altered any of the CVs in the decoder, so I reckon with a little bit of tinkering around with those CVs, I may be even able to get an even slower crawl out of the locomotive. So I guess in conclusion, really at the end of the day, is this locomotive worth having in your collection? And yes, it is, but with the caveat of price. Would I go out and buy this locomotive at its retail price? Probably not, but because I managed to get hold of this at a mere £79, I think the locomotive was well worth every penny that I actually spent on it. Now, admittedly, yes, the tooling goes back 10 years and it might not be up to some of the tooling standards that we have currently, but I think for the fact that when this came out in 2011, 2012, it would have been up there with some of the best tooling. So as you're probably aware, there's been quite a number of reviews of Hornby products, and they have been pretty brutal, and in many cases rightly so, unfortunately. But in the case of this Hornby Class 01, it paints a picture of what Hornby can achieve, and even back 10 years ago producing models that stood up well in the market. So there we have it for the very first review from Station Road. So in this particular outcome, it's reasonably favourable, I think, as to what I've purchased and essentially what I make of this particular model by Hornby. So you would have noticed during the review I made some comparisons with other current models, and one is the very recent Bachmann Class 47, which I will be doing another review of. Then there was the EFE Rail Class 35 Hymic, and that will also be reviewed in the near future. So you may have noticed too in the running session there was 2 of the Oxford Rail Pilchard wagons, and these 2 will actually come up in a review at some point. So being a first review, there's probably things possibly that I've missed. I've hopefully sort of covered everything that I wanted to cover in this review. I didn't want to go into huge amounts of detail in regard to things like the mechanism and so forth, but as I mentioned at the beginning, it's more about what you're going to get when you buy an item for X amount of dollars or pounds. So I'll sign off for now. Please do leave your comments. It would be really interesting to hear from you if there's any glaring omissions that maybe I should include in my next review. And also it'd be interesting to hear from anyone who has purchased one of these locomotives and possibly has had not such a successful outcome. So do take care everyone, do look after yourselves, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.